My name is James Herbert, and I am the Interim Director of the Gitxaala Territorial Management Agency. The agency is responsible for managing and protecting the nation's territory, which goes from just south of the Douglas Channel in the Great Bear Rainforest all the way up to Prince Rupert in what's now called British Columbia. Everything stems from the culture, and the nation was always opposed to that mine, and one of the real reasons they were opposed to that mine is because they didn't have a lot of sense of control or ownership or even understanding of what was going to happen there, and they felt like their concerns were not met during the very brief consultation period that happened around the Mines Act authorization for it. And unfortunately, all of those concerns came to pass when the mine broke 32, I believe, conditions of their mines permit. Culturally, it's devastating in a way that I'm not able to speak about as not a community member, but I've had numerous lessons shared with me and stories shared with me and about the kind of pain and, for lack of a better term, kind of cultural trauma that exists from just knowing that that mine site still sits there, leaking into the environment, acid generating rock potentially being everywhere. And the mine site, frankly, just being abandoned and uncleaned up is a real kind of cultural problem for the nation because it sits in the middle of Banks Island. And Banks Island is a cultural kind of hub for the nation. It's their breadbasket, it's where they do a lot of harvesting. So it's a really important location, that whole island, and the mine sits right in the middle of it. And so just knowing there's an uncleaned up space that sits there has some real trauma to the nation. Then when we do my work on it, where we've gone and done the environmental impact studies on it, and we've gone and looked at the problems with the acid generating rock and the problems with some of the large amounts of cadmium and arsenic and stuff that were put into the wetlands that surround, and then wash down the creeks and into the rivers and then down and into the mussels and the kelp and the seaweed and the seafoods that the nation harvests. Trying to the expense of getting your handle on all of that has been a real problem for the nation. Problems come from trying to even get a handle on what those environmental impacts are. Not a lot of nations are provided the ability to even know what the risks are. So their ability to know what the risks are and how much it might cost them to mitigate it, let alone knowing what the problem would be and how much it would cost if something went wrong. Most of our engagement and consultation process is that the Crown runs through don't facilitate that conversation. So it's hard to have even a good aspect or a good informed part of free, prior, and informed consent when you're not provided the ability to look at and analyze what all of those potential risks might be. The nation was pretty optimistic when DRIPA was drummed and sung onto the parliament floors. That had a lot of meaning. In the mineral tenure case that Gitxaala brought forward, the Human Rights Commissioner argued that the Crown needs to recognize that drumming and singing the law onto the floor was part of accepting that there are two legal orders. There are Indigenous legal orders and Crown legal orders. And so that was an optimistic time. I'd say it's pretty clear that the nation's disappointed how the court ruled on it. But the nation has never, Gitxaala itself has never once conceded or surrendered any of its territory or its land. And so the nation's need to run its own management authority, its own environment, its own social and economic development, basically manage its territory through what in Gitxaala law is called the Adach the and the Googliants has always been a driving force for the nation, and they'll continue to do that regardless of what kind of laws are put in place. The Gitxaala laws itself are frankly better suited to run the environment in Gitxaala territory than Western laws are, and I'm hopeful that eventually my own government will start to recognize that. And I think as we move through cases like this, we're slowly getting people to start to recognize that there are more than one way to manage an environment. one of the things I've reflected on quite a lot is there's an idea that there are just moments in time, especially with Western legal processes or the way we work and change jobs and do everything, that they tend to be distinct moments in times. And what I've learned in being honored enough to work with Gitxaala over the last 8 or 9 years is that there isn't moments in time. It's just a slow, consistent step and progress and existence that you're always trying to strive to do something better and to take lessons out of everything. As we learned lessons in one small field, we've really tried to take on the Gitxaala knowledge and teachings that allow us to kind of spread that out and to work through never-ending processes rather than single points in time. And I think it speaks to the hereditary system. It speaks to the continuation of chiefly names that have gone back for 6,000 to 7,000 years, 10,000 years. That there's always been this sense of continuity in First Nations, at least in the Indigenous folks that I've been honored to work with, and Gitxaala specifically. And that continuity, I think, really helps you situate all of the lessons you've learned and all of these things, that they can be applied constantly. You're constantly building on them. And so it's been a real huge impact for the work we've done specifically on the mineral tenure case, spreading out into how we even organize our guardian program. We should be filing fairly soon, and we're looking at getting into court probably in the new year, just with the slowness of how court proceedings go. But while we've been doing that, we've been looking at many different options, and we've been discussing options with our partners and with the Crown. We've been looking for solutions that, again, uphold Gitxaala law. And so that's where we are right. I think that there's a strength in that often people overlook. And then specifically with the mineral tenure case, I think a lot of it is being aware of the information that's coming to you and trying to digest a lot of this stuff. Is not always easy, and it's not always represented properly. And so being able to reach out to your leaders, reach out to organizations like Raven, read the blog post Raven have put out, try to really get your head wrapped around what this case means, both in terms of resource extraction, but also in the larger sense of moving into what I hope is eventually a true reconciliation between settlers and Indigenous folk, and help us all kind of mesh those two worldviews a little bit closer. It's not an easy thing to do, and I think anybody taking any steps is super helpful. I think there's some opportunity to do personal work on just coming to understand kind of the legacy of colonialism in your own backyard. And the MTA is a really good example of that, because it is one of the oldest colonial laws, and it is incredibly colonial from the way it started. I mean, it's a gold rush era. Mining is the best thing to do on a land. Like that's the premise of it. And so to be able to take it as an example of what your own government has done, and the kind of moving past that idea of extractive. I mean, we were colonizing to get stuff. And I think there's a lot of that kind of knowledge is helpful when people start trying to settle their own position and where they set as a settler, and make all the land acknowledgements and all the kind of cultural practices and street sign changes and stuff that I really love to see, but make that really resonate about why it's changing. I think understanding some early colonial laws is really a good way to situate that in your own head. We were talking about going to a system that worked. We know it worked, because for at least in Western terms, Gitxaala has occupied its territory for 10 to 12,000 years. We know they did that successfully. We know that the populations were sustained. We know that the food and the environment and the water and the air was healthy enough to sustain, frankly, a much larger population that exists there now. And so I find it interesting sometimes that we're talking about like the new way of doing things when we're looking at returning to a place of past success. So that's, I think that in that whole realm of of where we're going as a culture. I think it's important for people to contextualize that in the way that they're thinking, rather than, we didn't show up here and there were no herring. We didn't show up here and there were no trees. So someone had it working well, and maybe we should be thinking about that.
Mm-hmm.